Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello, we are from Group 8 of Basic Analysis of Drama. And on this occasion, we would like to discuss about discordance in structure of time and space, the structure and presentation of space, and the structure and the presentation of time. Before we discuss the material, I would like to introduce the member first of Group 8. The first one, there is me, Adiyanto Edo Nugraha. The second one, there is Kevin Barker Sembiring. And the last, there is Vivit Anggun Novianti. Okay, let's just get started. For the first discussion will be presented by Vivit Anggun Novianti. It's yours.
Okay, thank you, Adi. Well, let me present the first subtopic, which is about discordance in structures of time and space. Well, the closed or open structures of time and space as interlinked phenomena, as if, for example, closed structures of space always imply closed structures of time. And in practice, this is indeed what usually happens. However, there is a category of texts in which the structures of time and space are discordant. That is, where one is open and the other is closed. One extreme example of a text in which unity of space is combined with a time structure that exhibits a radical discrepancy between the actual performance time and the fictional time is Thornton Wilder's one-act play, The Long Christmas Dinner, 1931. Now, in this play, the locale, the dining room in the house of the Bayard family remains constant throughout and presents the decline and fall of the family over a period of 90 years. This long period of time is presented scenically in condensed form as a montage of an accelerating series of Christmas dinners. Next slide, please. The structure and presentation of space. The function of space in dramatic and also in narrative text is not simply confined to the fact that every story needs a setting or to the secondary subordinate function of providing an environment in which the participating figures can act out the story. It's particularly true of drama, which after all presents space not only verbally but also in some concrete visual form. Next slide, please. Well, the additional functions of space are not merely restricted to the fact that it creates a certain environment conditioning the figure's action and that it can actually characterize those figures, but they also include its model forming role. As said by J.M. Lodman, behind the presentation of things and objects that form the environment in which the figures of the text perform, there is a system of spatial relations, namely the structure of the topos. Next slide, please. The relationships within a single locale. As far as the spatial relationships within a single locale are concerned, the juxtaposition of the different figures or groups of figures are already inherent in the dialogical form of the drama. The presence of several figures on stage at the same time who communicate dialogically with one another implies some form of spatial relationship of distance or proximity, and the opposition of left and right can be interpreted semantically in terms of conflict or consensus. Next slide, please. The relationships between stage and offstage. It is often, though not explicitly, the case in dramas consisting of a single locale that the spatial contrast between the stage and the offstage area is modeled to represent a central semantic opposition. Well, this sort of semantic interpretation of the contrast between interior and exterior space is particularly common in modern dramas, written under the intellectual auspices of existentialism, and they often make considerable play of archetypical notions of space, such as the uterus, caves, and labyrinth. Next slide, please. The relationships between a number of different locales. The relationships linking different locales produce the clearest and most tangible contrast because several different and often contrasting locales are presented visually in the course of the play. While Shakespeare's plays, which are dramas of movement virtually throughout, contain innumerable examples of this, and of all his plays, it is especially the comedies that exhibit a particularly transparent spatio-semantic arrangement. Slide, please. Fictional locale versus real spatial context. There is one type of relationship that exists on a different level to the ones dealt with above, namely the relationship between the fictional space and the real spatial context of the intended audience. The decisive parameter clarifying that the underlying intention behind the text and the status of the text is distance or proximity. Next slide, please. The locale and the events. King Lear on the storm-blasted Health 3, 2, and 4, and the lovers in the moonlight garden at Belmont, the Merchant of Venice 5E1 are memorable examples of semantic correspondence, that is, of the harmony between the inner moods and actions of the figures and the actual spatial setting. In both of these examples, the figures are themselves aware of this correspondence and specifically refer to it in their speeches. Slide, please. The conceptions of space, neutrality, stylization, and realization. Well, a comparative study of the ways that the dramatic setting or local has been visually realized over centuries will reveal a broad spectrum of variations, stretching from abstract neutrality to a sharply focused realistic type of scenic and enactment. Visual realization in classical Greek tragedy, for example, scarcely went beyond the given stage set, which remained the same whatever the play and which only occasionally was complemented with additions such as an altar or a tombstone. In Elizabethan theater, the locale was still represented by little more than the permanent stage itself. The stage platforms, supporting pillars, trapdoors, doors, upper stage, and the discovery space of the inner stage, and etc. Though various other emblematic items such as mountains, city gates, caves, tents, or supporting platforms became increasingly popular as additional stage properties. While classical French drama and Weimar Classicism, on the other hand, already began to implement painted two-dimensional backdrops, which helped the audience to identify a specific locale, but did not go so far as attempting to present a realistic illusion. They remain little more than a marginal framework which uses abstract stylization to point at what the local might be and with which the figures and virtually no physical or haptic contact. Next slide, please. Functions, well, corresponding to these different levels of realism with which a locale can be presented on stage are the different functions of space. We shall begin by examining the kinds of space that are presented most specifically and realistically. At one extreme, this particular conception of space may be invoked in order to create the spectacular visual effects with which, for example, the stage extravaganzas of the 19th and 20th centuries attempted to thrill their audiences. At the other extreme, it may serve to recreate the contingencies of reality. It is this second function that predominates in the theater of naturalism, where the wealth of material detail which surrounds the figures also has the additional function of emphasizing the extent to which the figures are conditioned by external circumstances. Next slide, please. Well, I think that's all from me. The next presentation will be delivered by the next speaker.
Okay, for the next material, I will explain about the structures of time and space. So the external condition of social environment and atmosphere goes hand in hand with an emphasis on more general human qualities in favor of the more specific and individual. The qualities are the representative of a particular class, such as the imposing dignity of magnificent palatial setting to represent a powerful ruler. In naturalist drama, the spatial context shapes and determines the individual figures. Space is used predominantly as a way of projecting certain levels of inner awareness and only provides a rather rudimentary image of real space. Some forms of modern drama, such as expressionist theater, went even further in excluding any reference to real space and in using stage setting to serve as a channel for projecting the inner workings and conditions of the soul. Next is localization techniques. So the localization techniques, by analogy with the character, the this localization techniques, by analogy with the characterization techniques from a close repertoire that may derive from the repertoire codes and channels at the disposal of theatrical text. For example, Elizabethan verbal localization, naturalist drama, visual, or the other non-verbal techniques. And the next one is about verbal localization techniques. So the expression of verbal localization technique refers to the phenomenon that is generally known as word scenery or spoken space. That is the way the spatial context is portrayed or referred to in a figure's utterance. The immediate function of word scenery in Elizabethan drama, for example, was to compensate for the restricted means in the scenic presentation. The function of word scenery is not completely taken up with compensating for the lack of an explicit stage sets. It may transcend this function and contribute towards figure characterization and development of central themes, often in the shape of let, motif-like image, and in more general terms, the semantic structuring of stage space. And the next one is nonverbal localization technique. So, nonverbal localization technique is the representation of space by means of stage set consisting of scenery, accessories, and props or property. It forms a part of specific inventory of dramatic text that enables the author to achieve a convincing three-dimensional quality. In other words, their presence on the stage is enough to give the dramatic text a certain special dimension, and their positioning and movements are what brings the space to life. A space that is both created, sustained, and restricted by the stage area. And the next one is about tense, immediacy versus distance. So the relationship between fictional time scale with the play and the real time scale of the presentation is relevant for the intention underlying the text. It is important to establish whether the fictional action is set un, in the unspecified world of myth, a clearly identifiable historical period in the immediate present of world of the audience, or the in a historical and temporal and unidentifiable period, because the relationship between the text and the contemporary reality varies according to the amount of chronological distance between them. And then the next one is the succession and simultaneity. On the axis of succession, one incident follows another, whereas on the axis of simultaneity of number of different situation, action, or event considered to make up the dramatic situation. This simultaneity applies both the actions and events that are presented scenily and those that occur off stage and which are related verbally, either they either as they occur or ret- retrospectively. So there are two levels. The first one is basis of text, and the second one, the presentation of that story. Okay, that's all from me. And the next discussion will be presented by Kevin Parker Sembiring. Thank you. Okay, maybe we have to wait. Kevin, Kevin, are you there? Kevin 11. Okay, Kevin, it's your turn.
Okay, next, fictional time and actional performance time. Actual performance time, we mean the duration of the performance, the period of time it takes to perform the play, minus in the intervals, in order to eliminate all possible misunderstandings. We should like to emphasize that actual performance time is not the length of time that a scanically present process would cover in real life. This would be virtually impossible to calculate, but the length of time needed for the performance. Next slide, please. Primary, secondary, tertiary fictional times difference. First, primary fictional time is the total length of the time covered by the action presented directly on stage. Secondary fictional time is the fictional period that begins with the point of attack. 57 is the beginning of the action presented on stage and finishes with the end of the drama, but includes any time that has been omitted in periods of chronologically hidden action. And the last, tertiary fictional time refers to the fictional duration of the story from the beginning of purely. Next slide, please. If we start off by taking a hypothetical drama, whose time structure is characterized by the fact that the 13 time covered by the story coincides completely not only with the primary and secondary time spans, but also with the actual performance time, that it will soon become clear that the discrepancy that normally exists between the actual performance time and the fictional duration of the presented can be bright in two ways. First, by means of verbal summary of the events that take place off stage during, before, or after the play itself. Second, by compressing the events taking place within a scan and just abbreviating the primary fictional time in comparison to the actual performance time within the uninterrupted time space continuum of an individual scan. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, next, the conception of time. Conception of time underlying a particular text, like the various conception of space, figure, and plot, is a historical category, and as such is conditioned not by the systematic pattern of communication structures, but by particular intellectual or social historical ideas. Next slide, please. Objective chronometry is the subjective perception of time. Contrast between a conception of time in which the objectivity of empirical chronometry predominates and one that is based on a more subjective perception of time. Contradiction in the chronology and the extension of or compression of the fictional time are generally associated with a subjective conception of time. And this subjectivity is something that the figures themselves can be aware of or something that the spectators can discover and reflect on. Next slide, please. Progression versus thesis. Periods of time in which there was little or no action or movement were usually banished to the intervals assuming they were included in the story at all. Time is generally conceived as a chronological progression and succession of events rather than a static condition. Durative and interactive events are associated with such a static conception of time. In the same way, the action which brings about change in the situation is associated with a progressive conception of time. Next slide, please. Linear versus cyclical movement. Conception that interprets time as a form of cyclical repetition of identical or similar phenomena. The set of stories, plays which are linked together by the notion of progress inherent in the teleological framework of the Tudor myth, with the Tudor dynasty interpreted as the culmination of the historical process, is also a prime example of a series of cyclical plot structures describing the repeated usurpation and the ensuing loss of power. The cyclical repetition of Christmas festivities and the growth and decline of three generations is emphasized by the repetition of the same almost hackneyed expression and the same procedures and action. This is designed on the one hand to make the audience aware of the passing of time in a way that is more noticeable than if it were presented as a form of linear development. On the other hand, it also suspends time in the eternal repetition of similar episodes. Next slide, please. The literary text and the text in performance. Dramatic tempo is an aspect of drama that is discussed far more often by those involved but with theatrical practice than by dramatic theories. Tempo in drama must be analyzed principally on two different levels, the level of literary text and the level of the multimedia performance of the text. First, the literary text usually contains an implicit and more or less precisely identifiable tempo that might also be defined explicitly in the secondary text. Second, the multimedially performance text can then latch onto them onto these tempo markers and put them into practice. Next slide, please. Deep structure and surface structure. The natural scientist defines tempo as the ratio of unit of length, area or space per unit of time, or the ratio of events per unit of time. The first of these can be applied in the context of dramatic analysis to determine the speeds of various types of movement. Mime, gesture, and choreography, for example, and the second to measure the tempo at which one event is succeeded by another, frequency of the change of speaker or situation. Second, it can also be dysfunctional and reflect a degree of aesthetic incompetence on the part of the author if the tempo is too fast. It is only when the theme on both levels are perfectly simulate the impression of a consistent tempo, whether high or low. If the tempo is high, then this means that every one of the swift series of unternames represents a speech arts that affect the situation and that its nuance or change of position. Grooving and configuration drives the story onwards towards its final crisis and conclusion. Next slide, please. The tempo of the text as a whole. The tempo category that applies to the text as a whole is the ratio of situation change to the secondary performance time. That is, the period time that begins with the point of attack and ends with the last scanically presented dramatic situation. The overall tempo of dramatic text is therefore dependent on the number of peripetties it contains and on the level of chronological concentration. The classical drama, with its highly concentrated and close the structure of time and space, presents conflict with a high concentration of precipitia and achieves a high overall tempo because of its particular structures of time and plot. Next slide, please. Tempo variations, rhythm, and suspense. In most cases, the dramatic tempo does not remain constant throughout. However, in some cases, the tempo may show. In others, it may accelerate or relax conversation characterized by a long speech is allowed to develop into an argument made up of a fast exchange of short stichomatic utterance. Conversely, a healthy succession of rapidly changing configuration may give way within a single scan to more a permanent static configuration. Its play has an overall average tempo, and it's presumably the version of the tempo above and below average that is implied by the frequently used but seldom precisely defined concept of dramatic rhythm. Variations in tempo may also influence the intensity of dramatic suspense, and of course, within certain bounds, the suspense might be heightened by either accelerating or reducing the tempo. Accelerating insofar as the swift change in the situation may lead to the constant creation of new arcs of suspense and a slowing down insofar as the arcs of suspense are broadened or expanded. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all from us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, everyone.